The moment Karen snapped the lock on my shed with her shiny red bolt cutters, the entire sky seemed to shift. A blinking red light immediately began pulsing above the door, a mechanical voice calmly stated, "Containment breach detected," and less than 10 seconds later, a low drone rumbled through the neighborhood. She took one look inside, screamed like she'd seen a ghost strapped with dynamite, and ran face-first into a bush of my wife's prized roses. The irony? I was only gone 15 minutes, just long enough to buy mulch. By the time I returned, the block was swarming with black SUVs, federal agents in bomb suits, and one very pale Karen trying to explain why she'd broken into a government-registered explosive storage unit. 3 weeks earlier, this place had seemed like paradise. Quiet neighborhood, beautiful trees, a tight-knit street tucked away from the city noise. I'd bought the house on a retired military pension, looking forward to the kind of silence I'd never had while serving. After 15 years working in EOD, explosive ordnance disposal, for the Army, then on loan to Homeland Security, all I wanted was a few tomatoes in the garden, some peace in my bones, and maybe a cold beer every now and then. What I didn't account for was HOA Karen. Her real name was Karen, if you can believe that, and she wore it like a badge of honor. Blonde bob, reflective sunglasses, and a clipboard she carried around like it was a sacred tablet. She'd made it her mission to micromanage everyone's life down to the length of grass blade. I tried to be polite at first. I really did. I even went to one of the HOA meetings, where she spent 25 minutes arguing about the proper shade of beige for outdoor furniture. That was enough for me. I nodded through her passive-aggressive welcome package, complete with a list of fines she'd already flagged for me even though I hadn't officially moved in yet. Offenses included unapproved curtain colors, rustic mailbox shape, and military-grade shed being an eyesore. I told her I'd speak to legal about the shed complaint, which earned me a very forced smile and a "we'll be watching you closely, Evan." The shed was off-limits. Everyone had been told. The signs were clear, literal signs, including one with federal language. What Karen didn't know was that Homeland Security had contracted me to house a secure unit for training and equipment prep. Nothing live. No active ordnance. But the crates looked real enough to make a thief think twice. It was a win-win. I kept it locked, inspected, and documented. Every 6 months they ran routine checks. Everything was legal. But apparently, in Karen's twisted little power-hungry mind, anything she didn't approve must be illegal. The real trouble started when Karen began peering over the fence more than usual. I'd catch her lurking while pretending to measure hedges or jogging in her sandals. One afternoon she was crouched by my backyard gate, holding her dog's leash like she'd just happened to stop by. She asked if she could see inside the shed. I declined. She asked again, but with that dangerous tone, the kind that says she already believes she has authority. I told her, word for word, opening that shed without permission is not only trespassing, it may trigger a federal response. She laughed like I was joking. But I wasn't. The shed was wired with motion sensors, biometric locks, and a low-tier automated response system designed to ping Homeland Security if breached. I told my neighbor Rick about it later. Rick's a good guy, a retired firefighter who drinks too much iced tea and owns a parrot that swears in Spanish. He'd lived next to Karen for a decade and warned me she wasn't just annoying, she was dangerous when bored. According to him, she once called the cops because a neighbor had unlicensed wind chimes. Another time, she filed a complaint against a disabled veteran for having a ramp that didn't match community aesthetic. I asked him why nobody stood up to her, and he just sipped his tea and said, "Some fires aren't worth lighting unless you've got the hose and the backup engine." So I waited. I documented everything. I installed a new trail cam aimed toward the shed in case of vandalism. I double-checked the sensors. And I went on with my peaceful life, refusing to let her provoke me. That is, until mulch day. I left the house around 11 a.m. to pick up garden mulch. My wife was out at work, and the yard was quiet. I figured I'd be back in under 30 minutes. I should have known better. Karen had been circling for days, and the second my truck disappeared, she must have seen her golden opportunity. With bolt cutters in hand, she marched to the back fence, let herself through the unlocked gate, and snipped straight through the lock on the shed like she was opening a birthday present. The minute the lock was severed, three things happened. The red LED above the door began flashing, the shed's interior lights kicked on and triggered a verbal alert, and the internal sensor pinged a central server operated by DHS. The voice said, "Warning, Federal Containment Breach Log. Response initiated." Karen, expecting to find bags of fertilizer or illegal chickens or whatever her HOA-infested brain had cooked up, stepped inside, and immediately shrieked when she saw the military crates, blinking equipment, and sealed containers marked explosives, for training only. To her, it probably looked like a terrorist bunker. One of the neighborhood kids later said she ran faster than a YouTuber escaping a prank gone wrong. She tripped into the rose bush, then called 911 breathlessly claiming she'd just saved the neighborhood from a bomb-making operation. Unfortunately for her, 911 had already received a separate ping from Homeland Security, alerting them that a federal unit had been breached and a rapid response was underway. She didn't know it yet, but she had just triggered a federal lockdown of the entire block. I came back 15 minutes later to flashing lights, barricades, bomb techs in full yodi suits, and an entire street blocked off with yellow tape. I saw Karen seated on the curb, holding her bleeding hand from the rosebush, screaming at anyone who would listen that she was a hero. I was about to ask someone what happened when a DHS agent in full tactical gear pointed at me and shouted, "That's him." Within seconds I was face down on the hood of my truck, hands behind my back, until a voice from behind said, "Wait, Evan." I twisted just enough to recognize Agent Delgado. I hadn't seen her in years, but she hadn't changed. Sharp eyes, tighter bun, same air of no-nonsense efficiency. She looked down at me, then back at the chaos, then muttered, "You've gotta be kidding me." Then, calmly, she ordered them to uncuff me and turned toward the woman on the curb. Karen, now red-faced and furious, stood up and started screaming about terrorism, about safety, about how she was the president of the HOA and had every right to inspect suspicious structures. Delgado just raised one brow and said, "Ma'am, you just committed a federal crime." And just like that, everything changed. The atmosphere on Pecan Street had gone from sleepy suburbia to full-blown federal lockdown in under half an hour. What started with a nosy HOA president and a pair of bolt cutters had spiraled into a circus of flashing lights, tactical vests, and stunned neighbors filming from behind their curtains. Karen stood center stage, wobbling in her knockoff wedges, shrieking at anyone who would listen that she was the victim. She kept repeating the phrase "community threat," like it was a magic spell that would excuse everything. Meanwhile, the agents were more interested in examining the shed she'd broken into, now fully illuminated with its contents on full display. Sealed training crates, disarmed mock-ups of improvised devices, and one very expensive remote-operated bomb disposal robot named Otis. Agent Delgado, still in charge, turned her sharp gaze back to me after finishing a brief conversation over her radio. She motioned for me to step aside from the crowd and join her near the perimeter tape. "You've got quite the welcome committee, Evans," she said, voice low but laced with amused irritation. "And here I thought you retired to garden." I explained, again, that everything inside the shed was legal, documented, and part of the agreement I had with DHS. She knew that already, of course. We'd worked together on multiple ops, and I was still on the approved contractor list for non-live EOD training asset. But a protocol breach was a protocol breach, and Homeland Security took them seriously. Delgado walked me through what was happening. The moment Karen cut the lock, the motion sensor pinged a restricted access log into the federal server, triggering an immediate dispatch. Because the shed was listed under a containment-grade equipment facility, they had no choice but to respond as if it was a worst-case scenario. That meant lockdown, a full security sweep, and mandatory reports filed. All because Karen didn't like not being in control. I glanced over at her as she ranted to one of the agents, demanding he do something about the illegal explosives, unaware that the only thing truly illegal was her entire mourning. The neighbors were gathering now. Some were filming. Others were whispering. Rick stood on his porch with a lawn chair, holding up a glass of tea like it was popcorn. Across the street, Mrs. Tran clutched her Pomeranian while muttering prayers under her breath. The block, once known for its quiet hedges and HOA notices about holiday lights, now looked like it had been caught in the middle of a Homeland sting. And the more Karen talked, the worse it got for her. She dug herself into a deeper pit with every breath, accusing me of hiding bombs, accusing Delgado of protecting a criminal, even demanding that the agents check my garage, as if she expected to find a weapons cache beside my lawnmower. The funniest part, if you had the right sense of humor, was watching the agents' faces as they tried to process her logic. Karen wasn't just overstepping, she was diving headfirst into delusion. Delgado finally cut her off. "Ma'am, you entered a secured federal facility without authorization, bypassed a legal warning sign, destroyed property, and activated a national-level response protocol." Karen blinked. "That's not fair," she said. "It's just a shed. He's hiding something." "I know it." Delgado didn't even flinch. "Yes, he's hiding decommissioned training equipment for the Department of Homeland Security. And now, you've jeopardized an entire response chain because you didn't like how it looked." Karen's jaw moved, but no words came out. For once, silence did what logic never could. Still, Delgado had no choice but to process the breach. The standard procedure meant interviews, documentation, and a neighborhood statement. That meant agents fanning out across the block, knocking on doors, collecting footage from anyone with cameras, and trying to piece together Karen's intent. Was it vandalism? Was it ignorance? Was it politically motivated? The feds didn't care about petty HOA squabbles. They cared about risk. And anyone who would tamper with a facility like that without understanding the consequences was considered a potential risk. Karen just became a case file. I spent the next hour answering questions while Delgado and her team packed up the scene. Otis the robot was powered down and gently wheeled back into its charging dock. The crates were verified and scanned. All accounted for. No sign of tampering beyond the broken lock. That alone meant I was in the clear. But Karen? That was a different story. She was soon informed that she would be cited for multiple infractions: trespassing, destruction of federal property, triggering a false emergency protocol, and interfering with a Homeland Security operation. That didn't even include any HOA-based fallout. But what came next was something even I hadn't expected. One of the younger agents, a sharp-looking guy named Rainey, returned from canvassing the neighbors with a strange look on his face. He handed Delgado a small tablet. She scrolled through the footage, eyebrows slowly rising. Then she handed it to me. On the screen was a video Karen had posted just days earlier on the community forum. Her voice, proudly stating she'd find out what the weirdo in the corner lot is hiding if it's the last thing I do. She even joked about cracking that bunker open if the HOA doesn't act. I stared at the screen. There it was. Premeditation. Delgado didn't need long to react. "Well, that changes everything." She turned to one of her team members. "Contact legal. We've got intent." Karen, now sitting on the curb looking dazed, barely noticed. Her world was imploding, but she was still clinging to the belief that somehow, being president of a neighborhood committee gave her immunity from federal law. As Delgado laid it out, the full implications hit like a truck. Karen was facing actual federal charges now, not just a slap on the wrist. And those charges wouldn't just get her booted from her self-appointed throne, they could carry jail time. Later that afternoon, after most of the trucks had left and the yellow tape was pulled down, Delgado walked back over to me, arms crossed. "You attract trouble like a magnet," she said with a smirk. I chuckled. "Retirement's been weird," I replied. She told me they'd be in touch for the official report, but I was free to go. No penalties. No infractions. In fact, she added, I might even be eligible for a federal compensation claim due to the damage and breach of agreement. I didn't care about the money. Watching Karen's world unravel had already been more satisfying than any check. As I stepped back into my yard and looked at the battered rosebush, I took a deep breath and finally smiled. Karen thought she'd exposed a criminal. What she really did was open a door she was never supposed to touch. And now, the door wasn't just wide open. It was wired, recorded, and had the Department of Homeland Security standing on the other side. The following days were a strange blend of tension and entertainment. Word about the shed incident spread faster than wildfire on dry brush. News vans showed up by the end of the second day, trying to get interviews with anyone who had even blinked in the direction of my property. Some neighbors avoided their front porches entirely, while others couldn't resist their few minutes of fame. Karen, of course, was nowhere to be seen. Her perfectly trimmed hedges and always watered petunias now stood neglected, her porch light off, mailbox untouched. The queen of HOA drama had gone radio silent, and no one seemed to miss her. Inside my house, I kept things quiet. Delgado had warned me to stay low-key while the legal side worked itself out. Karen's video rant had given the Department of Homeland Security all the leverage they needed. What started as simple trespass was now being reviewed under charges of federal interference and intentional property breach. It didn't take long for the investigation to uncover more. Agent Rainey, young, sharp, and clearly enjoying every second of taking down an entitled suburban menace, showed me what they'd found while digging through HOA files. It turned out Karen had been funding some rather suspicious beautification initiatives using unapproved community dues. Thousands of dollars marked for tree maintenance, park benches, and a new irrigation system had quietly disappeared. Not a single invoice was filed properly. Most payments had been processed through a personal account labeled Community Betterment Committee, which, of course, didn't legally exist. It became clear that Karen's obsession with my shed wasn't just about authority, it was about distraction. She knew she'd been pushing the limits with her misuse of funds and fabricated infractions, and the shed gave her the perfect scapegoat. Something big. Something loud. Something to rally attention away from the growing whispers that she was embezzling HOA money. What she didn't count on was that she'd break into the wrong shed on the wrong property owned by the absolute wrong man. And I wasn't even the one who exposed her. Her downfall came from her own arrogance, broadcast in grainy videos, delusional text chains, and a long trail of financial documents just waiting to be audited. When Delgado confirmed DHS had officially opened a parallel investigation into the HOA board itself, I nearly laughed. I'd expected Karen to get fined or maybe slapped with probation. But a federal audit? That was poetic justice in slow motion. The agents weren't just looking into her now, they were reviewing every board member, every policy they'd signed off on, every suspicious vote, and every legal document they'd filed in the past 5 years. I was told the HOA could potentially face civil penalties if it was proven they enabled or ignored Karen's mismanagement. Most of them were already scrambling to distance themselves from her. Some tried pretending they'd never supported her decisions. Others whispered apologies when they saw me outside. I didn't respond to any of it. I let the silence speak louder than words. Rick, of course, wasn't shy about enjoying the chaos. He showed up with lemonade the next afternoon and parked himself on a lawn chair just inside my property line. "You know," he said between sips, "I've lived next to that woman for 10 years and she's managed to get 6 people fined for bird feeders. Bird feeders, man. This is karma backed by federal funding." His parrot, sitting on his shoulder, let out a string of Spanish curses that would have made Karen faint. "Don't worry," Rick added, "I'll testify for you. Or Otis if he wants to take the stand. That robot's a hero." Meanwhile, I kept busy repairing the shed. The lock had been destroyed, so I replaced it with a reinforced system and added another sensor for good measure. Delgado gave me the go-ahead to keep the EOD gear stored until further notice, though she did mention they might relocate it once the case against Karen proceeded. In the meantime, I received a letter from DHS confirming that I had not violated any agreement, and they would pursue restitution from Karen personally. That alone would cost her more than the HOA presidency ever paid her. Not that anyone believed she was ever paid. But her obsession with control had clearly offered her some hidden perks, ones she now had to explain under oath. That weekend, the neighborhood had its monthly HOA meeting, and I decided, for the first time since moving in, to attend. The room buzzed with nerves as I walked in. The folding chairs were full, the projector screen flickered, and Karen's seat, always dead center at the front, was conspicuously empty. Instead, a timid man named Walter, the HOA treasurer, took the stage. His voice cracked as he welcomed everyone, then immediately stuttered through an apology about recent events. When he tried to skip past the topic, someone in the back yelled, "Talk about the shed." Another added, "What about the missing money?" The room was turning fast, and Walter looked like he might melt. I didn't say a word. I just watched as the room turned on itself. Neighbors who once kept their heads down now wanted blood. They weren't just upset about Karen's break-in, they were furious about the deception, the lost funds, the abuse of power. Walter admitted that Karen had complete control over certain discretionary budgets and had bypassed oversight using emergency clauses in the bylaws. No one had ever questioned her because, in his words, she was loud and had a lot of binders. The audience erupted. Even the soft-spoken Tran family shouted for her resignation, which was ironic considering she was already facing charges. Then came the real surprise. Agent Delgado entered the room. She wasn't there to make a scene, just to deliver an official notice that the HOA was now formally part of a federal review. Every board member would be subject to interviews, and any attempts to delete or modify documents would be considered obstruction. She handed the notice to Walter, turned to me briefly, and nodded. I nodded back. The meeting ended in chaos. People left muttering, stunned, and angry. The HOA board was effectively paralyzed. The bylaws stated that in the event of legal incapacity, a community vote could restructure leadership. Rick joked we should nominate Otis the robot. I suggested his parrot. But in the end, it didn't matter who took over. Karen's reign was done. Her fake fines, bogus citations, and closet authoritarianism had finally imploded. All it took was a shed with the wrong kind of boxes. That night, I sat on my porch with a cold beer in hand, listening to the quiet hum of crickets replacing the sirens from days earlier. My wife joined me, flipping through her phone and chuckling at yet another meme someone had made of Karen's rosebush dive. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need fireworks. I had what I wanted from the start, peace, and the sound of an entire neighborhood finally waking up to the monster they'd let roam free, just because she wore a name tag and carried a clipboard. The fallout from the shed incident turned out to be more spectacular than anything I could have planned. By the following week, Karen's name had become synonymous with disaster in the neighborhood. A group of kids started calling her Boom Boom Karen, and someone even changed her contact in the neighborhood watch group chat to Karen the Shed Bomber. I didn't ask how I found out. People started forwarding me screenshots without solicitation, and each one was more ridiculous than the last. A meme of her mid-scream next to a badly photoshopped mushroom cloud. A parody HOA flyer listing rules Karen violated, Volume 1. I didn't laugh publicly, but internally, I'll admit, I savored every second of poetic justice taking root. The media wasn't far behind. It only took one local reporter to get wind of the situation, and then it was game over. A segment ran on evening television titled Suburban Bomb Scare, When an HOA Goes Too Far. They had drones capturing my backyard, blurred footage of Karen being questioned on the curb, and an overdramatic reenactment that included a very poorly constructed shed set with flashing red lights and stock explosion sound effects. It was absurd. It was also wildly popular. My phone buzzed with friends from all over the country texting, "Is this you?" Some wanted to know how I managed to keep calm. A few assumed it had to be staged. But most were just grateful it wasn't them. What surprised me most wasn't the media circus. It was Karen's next move. She filed a civil lawsuit. Yes, a lawsuit. Against me. For emotional distress, public defamation, and endangerment. Her claim stated that I had created a dangerous environment by storing bomb-making materials, and had maliciously orchestrated the public embarrassment that followed. She even had the audacity to suggest I had deliberately enticed her into entering the shed, knowing it would activate a response. It was the kind of legal fiction you'd expect from a courtroom drama written by someone who had never seen an actual law book. But Karen had underestimated how many enemies she had made over the years. The very HOA she once ruled turned on her in full force. Walter, the interim president, issued a formal statement distancing the board from all of her actions. Multiple neighbors submitted sworn affidavits detailing years of overreach, harassment, and fabricated fines. One woman brought receipts of a dog-barking citation Karen had issued her cat. Another neighbor presented photos of Karen parking her car in other people's driveways and then issuing citations for unauthorized vehicles. Delgado's team compiled all of it. Not because they needed it for their criminal investigation, those charges were already moving through the system, but because they were helping my legal team bury her civil suit under the weight of her own hypocrisy. The day of the hearing arrived and, like everything else Karen did, it was spectacularly unhinged. She arrived wearing what can only be described as a discount power suit and immediately began arguing with the bailiff about the parking validation. Her attorney looked like he'd aged 10 years during the walk from the parking lot. When the judge entered, she tried to address him directly, launching into a tirade about neighborhood safety, the dangers of men like me hoarding military secrets, and the trauma she'd endured. The judge shut her down in 2 words: "Sit down." My attorney barely had to speak. We submitted the DHS clearance documents, the training equipment manifest, the Homeland Security partnership contract, and the footage of Karen's forced entry. Then we dropped the bombshell, her public video post from 2 weeks before, in which she bragged she would crack open that creepy shed and expose me. Her own words, her own voice, her own downfall. The judge dismissed her case with prejudice and strongly suggested she consider legal counsel before attempting another misguided crusade. As if that weren't enough, DHS filed a separate suit for damages and federal interference. Karen was served the following morning, and this time, there were no cameras or dramatic exits, just her storming back into her house and slamming the door hard enough to make her porch gnome fall over. The HOA followed suit by voting her out permanently, citing violation of ethical standards and exposure to legal liability. A new board was established almost immediately, this time built of people who had no interest in Karen's little fiefdom. Walter resigned 2 days later, citing exhaustion. In his place stepped Gina, an ex-police officer, mom of 3, and perhaps the most no-nonsense person I'd ever met. Her first act as HOA chair was repealing every citation Karen had ever issued that wasn't backed by actual municipal code. That's how bad it had gotten. The neighborhood started healing fast. Without Karen's obsessive grip on every aspect of daily life, people started opening up. I was invited to more barbecues in 2 weeks than I'd been to in 10 years of moving around with the service. A group of kids helped me repaint the outside of the shed, which now featured an official DHS training zone placard gifted by Delgado herself. I offered to hold a safety seminar for anyone interested in what exactly was stored inside and how to respond in emergencies. To my surprise, almost every family showed up, including Rick, who brought Otis a bow tie and insisted the robot be introduced as our local hero. One Saturday, a few neighbors set up a projector in the cul-de-sac and hosted an outdoor movie night. Before the film started, someone queued up the news segment from my incident and played it on the big screen for laughs. People cracked up watching the reenactment, especially the part where a Karen lookalike tripped into a flower bed while fake bombs blinked behind her. It wasn't mockery. It was relief. Laughter at the absurdity that had once controlled their lives. A shared moment of triumph. As for Karen, her house went up for sale not long after. Quietly. No goodbye, no note. She packed her things under cover of night like a villain retreating after a failed scheme. No one helped her move. No one waved her off. Her listing was flagged for several code violations before it even hit the market. Ironic, considering the stickler she had once been. Last I heard, she'd moved to a different community across town, one without an HOA. Whether that was by choice or necessity, no one really knew. But what everyone did know was that our street had changed forever. The tyrant was gone, the fear replaced with freedom. Front yards bloomed with color again, mailboxes reappeared in non-regulation shapes, and a mural of a giant red bolt cutter was painted on the wall behind the park benches with the words, "Not today," Karen scribbled beneath. It wasn't revenge. It was resilience. We hadn't just removed a nuisance, we'd reclaimed our sanity. And all it took was one shed, one breach, and one very, very bad decision. Months passed, and the memory of Karen's disastrous crusade became less a sore spot and more a legendary story shared with laughter and a few eye rolls. The neighborhood that once tiptoed under her scrutiny had transformed. What used to be rows of dull beige fences and obsessively trimmed bushes were now decorated with flower beds, quirky gnomes, and even a few wind chimes that would have driven her mad. It was like the whole block had exhaled a breath it didn't know it was holding. For the first time since moving in, I felt like I truly belonged, not as the mysterious guy with the bomb shed, but as part of a community that had finally found its voice. The new HOA board under Gina brought structure without suffocation. Rules still existed, but they made sense now. Nobody was fined for the color of their curtains or the shape of their mailbox. People started trusting each other again. There were more block parties, more potlucks, more casual hellos from across the lawn. Children played outside without being shushed. Dogs barked without citations. It was a small suburban miracle. Gina even reached out to me about an idea. What if we turned the shed into a learning center for emergency awareness? Something useful for the kids, she said. Something that demystified what happened while teaching them how to respond if they ever encountered real danger. At first, I was skeptical. The shed wasn't a toy. It had been built to house real training gear. But the idea grew on me. I contacted Delgado, who surprisingly loved the proposal. With her support, we set up a mini public outreach project called Safe Zone, a scaled-down version of a bomb squad training exhibit. We installed proper signage, roped off areas, and set up fake devices with educational guides. Otis the robot was cleaned up, given a new coat of paint, and became the star attraction. Every Saturday morning for 6 weeks, neighborhood families would stop by for walkthroughs, safety briefings, and hands-on lessons on what to do, and what not to do, around suspicious materials. The turnout blew me away. Kids were fascinated. Parents were thankful. Even the local school board asked if they could add our demo site to their list of field trip options. I didn't charge a dime. I didn't want money. I wanted people to understand what Karen never did, that there are reasons some doors are locked, that authority without understanding is a recipe for chaos. Delgado visited often, sometimes bringing trainees or agents in training to help with the programs. She told me that Karen's incident had already become a case study in 2 departments, for legal overreach, community intervention, and the consequences of unauthorized interference with federal asset. Every so often, someone would bring up Karen, usually in passing, like a ghost story that wasn't quite scary anymore. Rumor had it that she was trying to start over in a new neighborhood, but that her reputation had followed her. Apparently, someone from our HOA had shared her old videos with her new neighbors. They weren't thrilled. Delgado mentioned Karen's civil fines were still stacking up. Between the lawsuit DHS filed and the HOA's countersuit to recover misused funds, she'd be paying for a very long time. Ironically, the woman who once fined someone for a mailbox color was now buried under real legal consequences. The real cherry on top came at the neighborhood's annual block fair. Gina had organized the first one in years, complete with food stalls, games for the kids, and a community talent show. As a surprise, the local fire department brought a bomb squad vehicle to show the kids the real deal. When Otis the robot was rolled out in tandem, the crowd went wild. Someone had even made little t-shirts for the children with the phrase, "Keep calm and let Otis handle it." The mood was light, joyful, and united. At one point, Delgado pulled me aside. She handed me a framed photo. It was a still from one of the surveillance cams. Karen, mid-scream, caught right as she opened the shed door with the blinking red light behind her. Underneath it was a small plaque that read, "Curiosity detonated the Karen." I couldn't stop laughing. It wasn't just a picture, it was a reminder. A frozen moment in time that captured the absolute absurdity of her choices and the way her entitlement finally collided with something bigger than herself. I hung the frame inside the shed, right above the main tool rack. Every time I passed it, it reminded me that sometimes the best revenge isn't fire or fury, it's living well while the rest of the world learns its lesson. Karen wanted power, but she never earned respect. She wanted control, but had no responsibility. She thought rules only applied to others, but the rules caught up to her. And they didn't come with HOA fines. They came with court dates, federal agencies, and a legacy she could never shake off. Life moved on, and so did I. My wife and I planted new rose bushes where the old ones had been crushed. We extended the garden. We adopted a dog. His name was Bolt. Partly because he was fast, partly as a nod to the infamous bolt cutters that started it all. He liked to nap beside Otis, who now had a permanent home beside the shed's reinforced door. The neighborhood embraced both of them like mascots, reminders that community can grow even from chaos. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast a soft orange glow over the houses, I sat on my porch sipping coffee. Rick came over, dragging a new lawn chair behind him, and dropped into it with a sigh. He glanced at the mural someone had painted on the HOA clubhouse wall, a comically large wooden shed with a neon, "Do Not Enter" sign and little cartoon figures of Karen being chased by Otis. He shook his head, smiling. "Man," he said, "if you'd told me a year ago that our biggest threat was a lady with a clipboard, I'd have laughed in your face." I nodded slowly, savoring the peace. Sometimes the biggest explosions don't come from bombs. They come from people who think they're the only ones who matter. Rick raised his glass. "To the neighborhood," he said. I raised mine too. "To the people who keep it safe. And sane." And somewhere deep in my shed, the little red light blinked once, calm and quiet, as if acknowledging that everything, finally, was exactly where it was meant to be.